The morning alarm at Edwards Air Force Base cut through the California desert silence at 0500 hours, just like it had every day for the past 40 years of Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Maggie Sterling's military career. At 58, she still beat most pilots half her age to the flight line, her silver hair pulled back in the same regulation bun she'd worn since she was 22 and desperate to prove she belonged in a cockpit. What the young hotshots at Edwards didn't know was that the woman they whispered about in the mess hall, calling her Granny Flyboy when they thought she couldn't hear, had more classified flight hours than their entire squadron combined. They saw gray hair and laugh lines and assumed she was riding out her time until retirement. They had no idea that Margaret Sterling was one of only 12 pilots in the world certified to fly aircraft that didn't officially exist. Major Derek Harrison was everything Margaret had learned to despise in her 4 decades of service. 32 years old, perfectly pressed uniform, teeth whitened to television commercial brightness, and a last name that opened doors his skills never could. His father, General William Harrison, had paved every step of his son's meteoric rise through the ranks. Where Margaret had clawed her way up through grit and excellence, Derek had glided on connections and charm. "Morning, Grandma Moses," Derek called out as Margaret performed her pre-flight inspection, his voice carrying just loud enough for the gathering maintenance crew to hear. "Hope you remembered your reading glasses. These new instruments have such tiny numbers." Margaret's hands never paused in their methodical check of the F-16's control surfaces, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 months ago, when Derek had taken command of the 412th Test Squadron, his first unofficial order had been to clean house of what he called legacy personnel. The message was clear. Older pilots, especially women, weren't welcome in his vision of a modernized Air Force. Captain Tyler Brooks, Derek's eager second-in-command, snickered from his position near the hangar. At 28, Tyler embodied everything wrong with the new generation of pilots. Technically proficient, but lacking the wisdom that came from years of making life-or-death decisions. His phone was already out, recording what he clearly hoped would be another viral moment for his social media followers. "Maybe we should get you one of those seat cushions, ma'am," Tyler added, his Kentucky drawl dripping with false concern. "You know, for the height? I hear they make excellent ones. For seniors." The maintenance crew shifted uncomfortably. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who'd worked with Margaret on dozens of test flights, opened her mouth to say something, then caught Derek's warning glare and fell silent. Everyone knew challenging the new commander was career suicide. Margaret finished her inspection and signed off on the maintenance log, her signature as steady as it had been decades ago. "Major Harrison," she said quietly, "I've been flying combat missions since before you could tie your own shoes. Perhaps you'd like to compare flight records sometime?" Derek's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with increased wattage. "Flight records? Ma'am, with all due respect, half your missions were probably flown on aircraft that belong in a museum. This isn't World War II anymore. We need pilots who can handle modern technology, not relics who learned to fly when computers filled entire rooms." The words hit their mark, as Derek intended, but what he didn't see was the way Sergeant Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly, or how Colonel Patricia Webb, watching from the tower, suddenly straightened in recognition of something she'd hoped never to witness. They knew fragments of Margaret's real history, classified details that Derek's security clearance wasn't high enough to access. Margaret climbed into her F-16 with the fluid grace of someone who'd done it thousands of times. As she ran through her startup procedures, she thought about her daughter, Jessica, who'd begged her to retire rather than endure this kind of treatment. She thought about her late husband, Michael, also a test pilot who'd died in a training accident 15 years ago. Most of all, she thought about all the young pilots, especially women and minorities, who Derek had already driven away with his toxic leadership. The radio crackled in her helmet as she requested clearance for takeoff. "Tower, this is Ghost 77 requesting permission to depart." "Ghost 77, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Have a good flight." "Colonel!" The tower controller's use of her real rank wasn't lost on those listening, but Derek was too busy posing for Tyler's camera to notice. As Margaret's F-16 roared down the runway and climbed into the desert sky, she allowed herself a small smile. Derek Harrison had no idea what he'd just started. That evening, Margaret sat in her modest off-base apartment, reviewing files that required presidential authorization to access. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Package confirmed. Weather window optimal for Monday. All systems green. The Ghost Phoenix has clearance to fly. Margaret's smile widened as she remembered the first time she'd earned that. Call signed 35 years ago in a situation so classified that the records were stored in a vault beneath the Pentagon. Derek thought he was dealing with an old woman clinging to past glory. In reality, he'd just declared war on someone who'd been winning air battles since before he was born. The next 72 hours would teach Major Derek Harrison exactly what a real warrior looked like, and the entire base would learn why some legends never truly retire. Monday morning brought the kind of clear, crisp weather that made flying pure joy, but Margaret Sterling felt anything but joyful as she walked into the squadron briefing room. Over the weekend, Derek Harrison had been busy. New policies were posted on every bulletin board, each one designed to make life difficult for senior personnel. Effective immediately, Derek announced to the assembled pilots, all flight personnel over 55 must undergo monthly medical evaluations. We need to ensure that reaction times and vision remain within acceptable parameters. Margaret kept her expression neutral, but several younger pilots exchanged uncomfortable glances. The policy was clearly targeted. She was the only pilot in the squadron over 55. Furthermore, Derek continued, warming to his theme, flight suits will be inspected daily for proper fit and appearance. We represent the finest fighting force in the world, and we should look the part. Captain Brooks stepped forward with a measuring tape and a smirk. Ma'am, if you could stand up, please. We need to verify that your flight suit meets current standards. The room fell silent. Even Derek's supporters seemed uncomfortable with the obvious harassment, but none dared speak up. Margaret stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the humiliation. As Brooks made an elaborate show of checking her uniform, his phone captured every moment. Brooks said loudly, this seems a bit loose. Regulation states that flight suits should fit properly for safety reasons. We can't have excess material getting caught in controls. Margaret's voice remained steady. Captain, I've been wearing regulation flight suits since before you were born. This one fits exactly as it should. Well, that's your opinion, Derek interjected, but I'm responsible for safety in this squadron. Captain Brooks, schedule lieutenant. Colonel Sterling for a new uniform fitting. We can't afford any safety risks. The meeting continued with more targeted policies. Mandatory technology training for all pilots over 50. We need to ensure everyone can handle modern avionics. Revised physical fitness standards that emphasize sprinting over endurance, and a new rule requiring all pilots to demonstrate cultural adaptability by participating in social media outreach. After the briefing, Margaret found herself cornered by Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres, one of the few people who'd shown her any support. Rachel was a brilliant pilot herself, but at 34 she was young enough to avoid Derek's immediate attention. Colonel, this is insane, Rachel whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. He's obviously targeting you. There has to be something you can do. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder. Sometimes, Lieutenant Commander, the best response to a bully is to let them think they're winning while you prepare your real response. What do you mean? I mean that Major Harrison is about to learn a very expensive lesson about assumptions. Margaret's smile was enigmatic. Just make sure you're on duty Thursday morning. You won't want to miss what happens next. That afternoon, Derek called Margaret into his office. The walls were covered with his achievements, most of them inherited rather than earned. His academy graduation photo sat prominently next to his father's official portrait. Margaret, he said, deliberately using her first name to establish dominance. I think we need to have an honest conversation about your future here. I'm listening, Major. Look, I respect what you've accomplished in your career. Really, I do. But times have changed. The Air Force needs pilots who can adapt to new technologies, new threats, new realities. Maybe it's time to consider retirement. You could go out with dignity, with honor. Don't make me force the issue. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying. Derek with the patience of a predator evaluating prey. Force the issue? That's an interesting choice of words, Major. Tell me, what exactly would forcing the issue look like? Derek's confidence seemed to inflate. Medical reviews, fitness evaluations, technological competency tests. There are lots of ways to ensure our pilots meet current standards. I'd hate for you to fail one of those evaluations publicly. I see. Margaret stood slowly. And if I pass all your evaluations? If I exceed your standards? Then you'll have proven my point about wasted resources. We can't afford to spend time and money on evaluations for pilots who should have retired years ago. Margaret paused at the door. Major, you mentioned new threats and new realities. Have you ever faced an actual threat? I mean, not in a simulator, but in real combat where mistakes mean death? Derek's jaw tightened. My qualifications aren't in question here. No, Margaret agreed softly. They're not. They're irrelevant. But mine? Well, you might want to do some research before Thursday. Look up something called the Phoenix program. Ask yourself why certain files require clearances you don't have. She left Derek staring after her, a seed of uncertainty planted in his arrogant certainty. That evening, Margaret met with Colonel Webb at an off-base diner that looked like it. Hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The two women sat in a corner booth speaking in voices too low for other patrons to hear. Patricia, I need you to do something for me, Margaret said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. Thursday morning, make sure base security has all cameras functioning perfectly. Every angle, every system. Patricia's eyes widened. Maggie, what are you planning? Please tell me you're not doing anything that could end your career. My career? Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. Patricia, my real career has been so classified that most people don't even know it exists. What Derek is attacking is just a cover identity I've maintained for operational security. The Phoenix program, Patricia breathed. I thought that was just rumors. Thursday morning, you'll learn exactly how real it is. And so will everyone else on this base. As Margaret drove home, her secure phone buzzed with another encrypted message. Ghost Phoenix, this is Control. Final authorization received. Package will be delivered at 0800 Thursday. Make it count. Margaret smiled as she pulled into her driveway. Oh, she intended to make it count. Derek Harrison wanted to see what a real warrior looked like. In less than 72 hours, he was going to get an education that no military academy could provide. The Ghost Phoenix was about to rise, and when she did, everyone at Edwards Air Force Base would learn why experience, wisdom, and respect mattered more than youth and arrogance. Wednesday morning arrived with Derek Harrison's confidence at an all-time high. His systematic campaign against Margaret Sterling was working perfectly. The monthly medical evaluations, uniform inspections, and technology assessments had created a paper trail that would justify any action he chose to take. Better yet, his social media following had grown exponentially thanks to Tyler's carefully edited videos of maintaining standards. Margaret arrived at the squadron ready room to find a crowd gathered around the assignment board. Someone had posted a mock retirement countdown calendar with her name on it, complete with jokes about senior moments and hangar flying stories. "Oh good, you're here," Derek announced loudly as she approached. "We need to discuss your performance review." He held up a tablet displaying what appeared to be her evaluation scores. "I'm afraid your technology assessment didn't go well. Apparently modern avionics are quite different from what you're used to." Margaret glanced at the scores and raised an eyebrow. "These are interesting numbers, Major, particularly since I haven't taken any technology assessment." "Of course you have," Tyler interjected, his phone already recording. "Yesterday afternoon, remember? You seemed confused by the new heads-up display systems." "I see." Margaret's voice remained calm, but Lieutenant Commander Torres noticed, her hands clenched briefly at her sides. "And who administered this assessment?" "I did," Derek replied smoothly. "As squadron commander, I'm qualified to evaluate pilot competency." The lie was so brazen that several pilots looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up. Margaret realized this was Derek's endgame. He was manufacturing evidence to force her retirement, and everyone was too intimidated to challenge him. "In that case," Margaret said quietly, "I'd like to request a formal review of these evaluations." Derek's smile widened. "I'm afraid that's not necessary. The results speak for themselves. Effective immediately, you're grounded pending a comprehensive fitness for duty evaluation." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Grounding a pilot was the ultimate humiliation, especially for someone with Margaret's record. Several of the younger pilots looked ashamed, but Derek's core supporters nodded approvingly. "Furthermore," Derek continued, clearly enjoying his moment of triumph, "I'm requiring you to surrender your flight suit and wings. We can't have someone wearing the uniform who doesn't meet current standards." This was the line Margaret had been waiting for him to cross. In 40 years of service, no one had ever questioned her right to wear the uniform she'd earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Derek's demand wasn't just professional, it was personal, designed to strip away her identity and dignity. "Major Harrison," she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Colonel Webb straighten in alarm, "are you ordering me to remove my uniform in front of this squadron?" "I'm ordering you to surrender items you're no longer qualified to wear," Derek replied, missing the warning in her tone entirely. "Your flight suit, your wings, your patches, all of it." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of jets on the flight line. Margaret looked around at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, others eager for humiliation, most simply uncomfortable. She thought about all the battles she'd fought to get here, all the times she'd bitten her tongue while lesser pilots advanced ahead of her, all the young women who'd looked to her as proof that it was possible to succeed in this male-dominated world. Then she began unbuttoning her flight suit. "If that's what you want, Major," she said softly, "then that's what you'll get." The deliberate slowness with which she removed each patch, each symbol of her service, created an unbearable tension in the room. Her silver wings, earned through years of training that had broken stronger candidates, came off with reverent care. Her squadron patches, representing decades of different assignments, were folded with military precision. Derek basked in his apparent victory, but Colonel Webb noticed something that chilled her blood. Margaret wasn't acting like someone who'd been defeated. There was a coiled energy in her movements, a predator's patience that suggested this humiliation was not an ending, but a beginning. "There," Margaret said, placing her flight suit on a nearby table. "Are you satisfied, Major?" "Very," Derek replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is what real leadership looks like. People making hard decisions, maintaining standards, putting excellence above sentiment." Margaret nodded slowly. "Excellence above sentiment. Yes, I think that's exactly what we're about to see." She walked toward the exit but paused at the door. "By the way, Major, you might want to check the flight schedule for tomorrow morning." "There's been a late addition." "What kind of addition?" Margaret's smile was sharp as winter wind. "A demonstration flight, something about advanced tactical capabilities. I believe all personnel are required to attend." Derek frowned, thrown off by her composure. Who authorized a demonstration flight? "Someone with the authority to do so," Margaret replied cryptically. 8 o'clock sharp, Hangar 7. You won't want to miss it." As she left, several pilots noticed that Colonel Webb had gone pale. She'd recognized something in Margaret's demeanor, some hint of the classified world that existed beyond their clearance levels. That evening, Derek hosted a celebration at the Officers' Club, regaling his supporters with the story of how he'd finally cleaned house. Tyler's video of Margaret's humiliation had already gone viral in military circles, with thousands of views and hundreds of comments ranging from cruel mockery to grudging admiration for Derek's decisive leadership. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," Derek told his audience, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Some mystery demonstration flight, probably just another bureaucratic waste of time, but at least we won't have to worry about Granny Moses embarrassing us anymore." If only he had bothered to check who had requested hangar space for tomorrow morning. If only he had wondered why the demonstration required unlimited vertical airspace. If only he had asked himself why every camera on base had been checked and rechecked by security. But Derek Harrison had never learned to ask the right questions. He'd spent his entire career having answers handed to him, never realizing that the most important knowledge came from understanding what you didn't know. Margaret Sterling spent her final evening as an ordinary pilot reviewing documents that existed in only 12 copies worldwide. Her secure phone had been buzzing all day with messages from people whose names never appeared in public but whose decisions shaped global policy. The Ghost Phoenix program was about to be revealed, and with it, the true identity of the woman Derek Harrison had just humiliated. Tomorrow morning, everyone at Edwards Air Force Base would learn what happened when you underestimated a living legend. Thursday morning arrived with perfect flying weather, unlimited visibility, calm winds, and not a cloud in the sky. Margaret Sterling stood in a hangar that didn't appear on any civilian maps, running her hand along the sleek fuselage of an aircraft that officially didn't exist. The F-22 Raptor before her wasn't just any fighter jet. It was a specially modified variant equipped with systems that would make aerospace engineers weep with envy. "Ghost Phoenix to control," she spoke into her secure radio. "Final systems check complete. All green across the board." "Copy that, Phoenix," came the reply from a voice that belonged to General Patricia Morrison, Margaret's handler for the past 2 decades. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once we reveal the program, there's no going back. Your cover will be blown permanently." Margaret climbed into the cockpit with the fluid grace of someone who'd done it thousands of times. "Patricia, I've spent 20 years pretending to be less than I am, accepting disrespect to maintain operational security. But what's the point of keeping secrets if we let people like Harrison destroy the very force we're trying to protect?" The irony was exquisite. Derek had publicly humiliated someone he assumed was a washed-up diversity hire. In reality, Margaret. Ghost Phoenix Sterling was one of only 12 pilots in the entire world certified to fly experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of physics. Her real rank, hidden behind layers of classification, was colonel with a brevet promotion to brigadier general that would activate the moment she retired from black operations. At Edwards Air Force Base, 300 personnel gathered in Hangar 7, grumbling about the mandatory assembly. Derek stood at the front with his command staff, irritated that someone had scheduled this demonstration without his explicit approval. "Does anyone know what this is about?" he demanded of his aide. "I don't like surprises, especially not on my base." Lieutenant Commander Torres, standing near the back with the other junior officers, felt her pulse quicken. She remembered Margaret's cryptic words about Thursday morning, about not wanting to miss what happened next. Something big was coming, and Rachel had the distinct feeling that Derek Harrison wasn't going to like it. Tyler Brooks had positioned himself for optimal filming, his phone ready to capture whatever bureaucratic presentation was about to waste their morning. He'd already started a live stream for his social media followers, promising behind-the-scenes content from a real Air Force base. At exactly 800 hours, the silence was shattered by a sound unlike any jet engine they'd ever heard. It started as a low whistle building to a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Through the hangar doors they saw a shape approaching at impossible speed, so low it seemed to skim the runway before pulling into a vertical climb that defied everything they knew about aerodynamics. The F-22 Raptor that appeared above them wasn't just flying, it was dancing. It executed a series of maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible: knife-edge passes at supersonic speed, vertical rolls with precision that made their most experienced. Pilots gasped and turned so tight they seemed to violate the laws of physics. Derek felt his mouth go dry. He'd seen hundreds of flight demonstrations, but nothing like this. Whoever was in that cockpit wasn't just a pilot, they were an artist, painting impossibilities across the morning sky. "Who the hell is flying that thing?" Tyler whispered, his phone shaking as he tried to record the display. "Those maneuvers, they're not in any manual I've ever seen." The F-22 completed a final series of rolls before descending toward the hangar with surgical precision. As it taxied closer, Derek noticed something that made his blood run cold. The aircraft bore markings he'd only seen in the most classified briefings, designation numbers that indicated this was no ordinary fighter jet. Colonel Webb, watching from her position near the hangar doors, felt a mixture of awe and dread. She'd suspected Margaret was more than she appeared, but this revelation was beyond anything she'd imagined. The canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The pilot removed their helmet, and Margaret Sterling's silver hair caught the morning sunlight as she stood in the cockpit, surveying the crowd below with the calm authority of someone who had just reminded the world what mastery looked like. "Good morning, everyone," her voice carried through the hangar's PA system. Someone had provided her with a wireless mic. "I'm Colonel Margaret Ghost Phoenix Sterling, and I'm here to discuss the importance of respecting experience over assumptions." Derek's face had gone from red to white to a sickly green that several people would later describe as the color of someone realizing they'd just stepped in something they couldn't clean off their shoes. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You're not a colonel. You're a lieutenant colonel. I saw your file." Margaret descended from the aircraft with the grace of someone who had done it countless times. "You saw what you were meant to see, Major. A carefully crafted identity designed to let me observe how the Air Force treats its senior personnel, particularly women. What you didn't see were the classified portions of my record." She gestured to the F-22 behind her. 23 years in the Phoenix program. Test pilot for aircraft that won't be public knowledge for another decade. 147 combat missions that officially never happened." The crowd parted as she walked toward Derek, her bearing radiating an authority that made several senior officers straighten instinctively. "While you were learning to tie your shoes, I was flying missions over territories we're not supposed to admit we've entered. While you were playing video games, I was testing aircraft that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. And while you were using your father's name to fast-track through the academy, I was earning decorations that don't get mentioned in public because the missions they commemorate don't exist in any official record." Tyler's phone captured every word, but his expression had shifted from smug anticipation to growing horror as he realized his viral video from yesterday had just become evidence in a case that could end his career. General Morrison chose that moment to enter the hangar, flanked by military police and JAG officers. The 4 stars on her uniform seemed to glow in the fluorescent lighting as she approached the gathering. "Major Harrison?" Her voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade. "You are relieved of command, effective immediately." The words "relieved of command" echoed through Hangar 7 like a death knell. Derek Harrison's face cycled through every shade of disbelief as General Morrison's entourage of military police and JAG officers spread out with the precision of a military operation, which, Margaret realized with satisfaction, was exactly what this was. "General Morrison," Derek found his voice, though it came out higher than usual. "There must be some mistake. I'm Major Derek Harrison, son of General William Harrison. My father—" "Your father," General Morrison interrupted coldly, "has been relieved of his advisory position pending a full investigation into how his influence allowed toxic leadership to flourish under his protection." "Did you really think nepotism could protect you forever, Major?" Margaret pulled out a tablet, connecting it to the hangar's main display system. The screens around them flickered to life, showing documents that made several high-ranking officers step closer in recognition. "Let's review some facts, shall we?" Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd briefed presidents on matters of national security. "This is my actual service record." The first document that appeared made the crowd gasp. Collectively, a silver star with valor device, the citation redacted but the date clearly showing it was earned during a conflict that had never been publicly acknowledged. "Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters," Margaret continued, scrolling through commendations that told the story of a career spent in the shadows. "Air Medal with V device and 23 oak leaf clusters, and this," she paused on a particular document, "is a presidential unit citation for a mission that saved 300 American lives. A mission I flew when you, Major Harrison, were 6 years old." Tyler Brooks, still recording despite his growing panic, tried to edge toward the exit. Security officers blocked his path, their expressions making it clear that leaving wasn't an option. "Captain Tyler Brooks," Margaret addressed him directly, her voice carrying across the hangar, "your social media campaigns mocking senior female service members have been documented and forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Every post, every video, every cruel comment. You thought you were building a following. In reality, you were building a case against yourself. Tyler's phone clattered to the concrete floor as the reality of his situation hit him. His streaming audience was watching. His military career evaporated in real time. The screens changed again, this time showing Derek's viral video from the previous day, the one where he'd stripped Margaret of her dignity in front of the entire squadron. The sound of his voice, filled with cruel authority as he humiliated her, filled the hangar. "This is what you chose to do with your command authority," Margaret said as they watched. "Humiliate someone based on their age and gender, without bothering to learn who they really were. You spoke about warriors, about the future belonging to the young and strong. Let me tell you something about warriors, Major. Real warriors respect. They're enemies enough to know them. You didn't even respect your allies enough to see them." Lieutenant Commander Torres found herself holding her breath as she watched her squadron commander's world collapse. Part of her felt sorry for Derek. He looked like a child who'd just realized he'd been playing with explosives. But a larger part of her felt vindicated for every time she'd bitten her tongue while he'd made dismissive comments about diversity hires and politically correct policies. General Morrison stepped forward, her 4 stars catching the hangar. "Lights?" "Major Harrison, your actions over the past 3 months have been under investigation by the Inspector General's office. What we've found goes far beyond simple prejudice." She nodded to one of the JAG officers who began reading from a thick folder. "Falsified fitness reports designed to force early retirement of selected personnel. Systematic discrimination based on age and gender. Creation of a hostile command environment that has resulted in the loss of 17 experienced pilots who requested transfers rather than continue serving under your leadership." Derek's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into a nearby chair. His entire identity, built on privilege and prejudice, was crumbling before an audience of 300 witnesses. "I was just maintaining standards," he whispered, but his words carried in the shocked silence. "Just trying to modernize the Force?" Margaret shook her head sadly. "No, you were trying to remake the Force in your own image, young, male, privileged, and utterly lacking in the humility that comes from real experience. You confused confidence with competence, cruelty with strength, homogeneity with harmony. The Air Force you envisioned would have been weaker, not stronger." One of the military police officers approached Derek with handcuffs, but General Morrison held up a hand. "Not yet, Sergeant. I want him to hear the rest." The screens changed again, showing a complex organizational chart that few people in the hangar had the clearance to fully understand. At the top was the Phoenix program, and Margaret's name appeared with connections to operations spanning 3 decades. "The Phoenix program," General Morrison explained to the assembled crowd, "is a black operations unit that develops and tests experimental aircraft for situations too sensitive for conventional forces. Colonel Sterling has been our primary test. Pilot for technologies that won't be declassified for another 20 years. She gestured to the F-22 that Margaret had just flown. "What you witnessed this morning wasn't just an impressive display of piloting skill. Those maneuvers were performed using systems that represent the cutting edge of aerospace technology. The aircraft itself is worth more than the entire annual budget for this base, and there are exactly 4 people in the world qualified to fly it." Derek looked up with desperate hope. "Then this is all a misunderstanding. If she's really a colonel, if she's really this important, then my father can fix this." "His connections?" "Your father," General Morrison said with icy precision, "spent yesterday in a closed-door session with the Joint Chiefs, explaining how his son managed to harass and humiliate one of the most valuable assets in the United States Air Force. He's currently considering early retirement to avoid a courts-martial for dereliction of duty." The hangar erupted in whispers as the implications sank in. Derek Harrison hadn't just made a career-ending mistake. He'd created a scandal that reached the highest levels of military command. Margaret approached Derek, stopping close enough that only he could hear her next words. 3 months ago, I told you that real warriors respect their enemies enough to know them. You failed that test spectacularly, but here's what you really need to understand. I'm not your enemy. I never was. You made me one." The next few hours passed like scenes from a perfectly choreographed military operation. As word spread throughout Edwards Air Force Base about what had transpired in Hangar 7, a different kind of demonstration began, one that showed the true power of institutional justice when properly applied. Derek Harrison found himself in an interrogation room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, facing a panel of officers whose combined years of service dwarfed his own pathetic resume. The lead investigator, Colonel James Mitchell from the Inspector General's office, had flown combat missions before Derek was born and had zero patience for privileged incompetence. "Let's start with the falsified fitness reports," Colonel Mitchell said, sliding a thick folder across the metal table. "We have documented evidence that you altered or completely fabricated evaluation scores for 17 different personnel over the past 3 months. Derek's hands shook as he opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of the original reports alongside the versions he'd submitted to higher command. The differences were stark and undeniable. Excellent scores changed to failing grades, glowing. Recommendations altered to suggest incompetence. "This is doctored," Derek said weakly. "Someone must have changed these to make me look bad." Colonel Mitchell's expression didn't change. "The original documents were retrieved from the secure server that logs every modification with timestamps and user credentials. Your access code was used for every single alteration." In another room, Tyler Brooks was discovering that social media evidence was just as damning as any official document. The cybercrime investigators had recovered dozens of posts, videos, and comments that painted a clear picture of systematic harassment targeting older personnel and women. "This video," one investigator said, playing Tyler's gleeful commentary over footage of Margaret's uniform being stripped away, "has been viewed over 50,000 times. In it, you explicitly state that you're cleaning house of diversity hires. And dead weight. Would you like to explain what you meant by that?" Tyler tried to backtrack. I was just supporting my commander, following orders." Following orders to film and mock a superior officer? Following orders to create hostile propaganda? "Captain Brooks, you're not a Nazi in 1945. Following orders isn't a defense for deliberate cruelty." Meanwhile, in the base's secure communications center, General Morrison was fielding calls from officials whose names were classified above Derek's clearance level. The Phoenix program revelation had triggered a cascade of security reviews and political damage control that reached the Pentagon's highest floors. "Yes, sir, I understand the sensitivity," she said into an encrypted phone, "but sometimes operational security has to be balanced against institutional integrity. We couldn't let this continue without revealing why it was so dangerous." Margaret herself was in a different kind of meeting, one where she was finally able to shed the persona she'd maintained for 2 decades. In a conference room surrounded by officials from various 3-letter agencies, she was debriefing not just the morning's events, but years of observations about military culture and leadership. "The toxicity wasn't limited to Harrison," she explained to the panel of investigators. "He was just the most visible symptom of a systemic problem. We have young officers throughout the service who believe that diversity and experience are weaknesses rather than strengths." A representative from the Department of Defense took notes furiously. "How widespread would you estimate this attitude to be?" "Based on my observations from multiple bases over the past 5 years, at least 30% of junior to mid-level officers show some degree of bias against older personnel, women, or minorities. Most aren't as blatant as Harrison, but the underlying beliefs are there." The afternoon brought Derek's formal courts-martial proceedings. The charges were read in a courtroom packed with military personnel who'd come to witness the downfall of someone they'd either feared or despised. "Major Derek Harrison," the Judge Advocate General announced, "you are charged with conduct unbecoming an officer, dereliction of duty, falsification of official records, and creating a hostile command environment. How do you plead?" Derek's military-appointed attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Derek seemed to be in shock. The golden boy who'd never faced real consequences for anything was struggling to comprehend that his privilege couldn't protect him from this moment. "Not guilty," he finally managed, though his voice cracked on the words. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. They presented testimony from the 17 pilots who'd been driven away by Derek's leadership, each story painting a picture of systematic abuse disguised as maintaining standards. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a Korean-American pilot who'd transferred to another base rather than endure Derek's constant jokes about her heritage, testified via video link. He told me that diversity quotas were lowering Air Force standards, and that I'd probably never have made it as a pilot if I'd been born 20 years earlier. When I outperformed him in every training exercise, he claimed I must have had advanced knowledge of the scenarios. Captain Michael Rodriguez spoke about Derek's age discrimination. "I'm 39 years old, and Major Harrison repeatedly referred to me as over the hill and suggested I should consider desk duty. He blocked my application for advanced training twice, claiming older pilots couldn't adapt to new systems." But the most damaging testimony came from Sergeant Rodriguez, the maintenance chief who'd witnessed Margaret's humiliation firsthand. "Sir, I've worked with Colonel Sterling for 8 years, she told the court. "She's the most professional, skilled pilot I've ever seen. What Major Harrison did to her wasn't about standards or modernization. It was about a weak man trying to feel strong by tearing down someone better than him." The defense tried to argue that Derek was simply following military doctrine about fitness and standards, but the prosecution demolished that argument with Derek's own words. They played audio recordings from his phone calls home, conversations where he bragged to his father about cleaning out the deadwood and creating a squadron of real warriors. "My son is implementing exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership the Air Force needs," General William Harrison's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet." The elder Harrison's fall from grace was equally spectacular. By Thursday afternoon, news outlets were reporting that the three-star general had been relieved of all duties pending investigation. His decades of using his position to advance his son's career had finally caught up with him. Tyler Brooks faced his own reckoning in a separate proceeding. The social media evidence against him was overwhelming. Dozens of posts mocking female pilots, older personnel, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of what a warrior should look like. His defense attorney tried to argue that Tyler was just a young man caught up in his commander's influence, but the prosecution had found posts dating back to his academy days. The pattern of prejudice and cruelty wasn't something Derek had created. It was something he'd encouraged and amplified. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said during closing arguments, "Captain Brooks didn't just follow orders. He weaponized social media to create a hostile environment that extended far beyond Edwards Air Force Base. His videos and posts were seen by military personnel worldwide, spreading toxic attitudes and damaging morale across the entire service." As the sun set over Edwards Air Force Base, Margaret stood in her real office, one that existed in the classified sections of the Pentagon's most secure databases. General Morrison sat across from her, reviewing the aftermath of what they were already calling the Phoenix Revelation. "The good news," Morrison said, "is that we've identified and removed two of the most toxic leaders in recent memory. The bad news is that this is going to create ripple effects throughout the entire command structure." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Patricia, sometimes you have to perform surgery to remove cancer. It's painful, but it's the only way to save the patient. The president wants to meet with you next week," Morrison continued. "There's talk of using this incident as a catalyst for broader reforms in military leadership training. And Derek? 20 years in military prison, reduction to private, forfeiture of all pay and benefits. Tyler got 15 years and a dishonorable discharge. They'll both be out of the service by tomorrow morning." Margaret felt no satisfaction in their destruction, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. Two careers destroyed because they couldn't see past their own prejudices. How many good pilots did we lose because of leaders like them? 3 months later, Edwards Air Force Base was a transformed place. The toxic culture that Derek Harrison had fostered was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something healthier, more inclusive, and ultimately more effective. Margaret walked through the squadron ready room that had once been the site of her humiliation, now serving as the headquarters for the newly established Advanced Leadership Development Program. The walls that once displayed Derek's ego-driven achievement photos now showcased the diverse faces of pilots from every background imaginable. Lieutenant Commander Torres, now promoted to commander and serving as Margaret's executive officer, briefed her on the morning's activities. "We have 37 applicants for the next leadership cycle," Rachel reported. They're coming from bases all over the world. Apparently, word has spread about what we're doing here. The program Margaret had designed wasn't just about flying. It was about creating leaders who understood that strength came from diversity of thought, experience, and background. The selection process focused on character and judgment rather than connections and privilege. "Any word from the Pentagon about the Harrison investigation?" Margaret asked. "Final report came in yesterday. They found evidence of similar toxic leadership at 12 other bases, all connected to officers who served under General Harrison at some point in their careers. The cleanup is going to take years." Margaret wasn't surprised. Derek's attitudes hadn't developed in isolation. They were the product of a system that had rewarded the wrong qualities for too long. The morning flight briefing was unlike anything the old Edwards would have recognized. The pilots gathered around the planning table represented every demographic the military served, men and women, young and experienced, from every ethnic background and region of the country. Captain Lisa Washington, a 35-year-old African-American pilot from Alabama, was briefing a training mission alongside Captain David Chen, a 26-year-old Chinese-American from California. The easy professionalism between them would have been impossible under Derek's leadership, where every difference was treated as a potential weakness. "Colonel Sterling," Captain Washington said as Margaret joined the group, "we wanted to thank you for what you did, not just exposing Harrison, but creating this program. It's given us hope that the Air Force can actually live up to its ideals." Margaret smiled, remembering her own early days when such hope had seemed naive. "Captain, the Air Force has always had these ideals. We just sometimes forget to live by them." The transformation wasn't limited to Edwards. News of the Phoenix revelation had spread throughout the military, triggering conversations about leadership, respect, and the true meaning of strength. Military blogs and forums buzzed with discussions about toxic commanders and the importance of speaking up against abuse. Derek Harrison, now Private Harrison, was serving his sentence at the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. Reports from the prison indicated he spent most of his time in the library, finally reading the leadership books his privilege had never required him to understand. Tyler Brooks had been released from military prison after serving 18 months, but his dishonorable discharge made finding civilian employment nearly impossible. The viral videos that had once made him feel powerful now served as permanent evidence of his character flaws. General William Harrison had quietly retired rather than face courts-martial, but his legacy was permanently tainted. The Harrison family name, once synonymous with military excellence, was now a cautionary tale about the dangers of nepotism and unchecked privilege. The most significant change was in military leadership training itself. Margaret's experience had prompted a complete overhaul of how the services identified and developed leaders. New emphasis was placed on emotional intelligence, cultural competency, and the ability to recognize and develop talent regardless of its package. "You know what the real victory is?" Margaret told Rachel as they watched a group of young pilots preparing for their afternoon training flights. "It's not the vindication or the recognition. It's knowing that the next Margaret Sterling won't have to hide who she is. The next experienced pilot won't be driven out because of their age. The next warrior will be recognized for their capability, not their appearance." The Phoenix program itself remained classified, but its existence was now an open secret that served as a reminder that the military's most valuable assets might not always be obvious. Margaret continued her work in the shadows, but now she also served as a visible symbol of what experience and dedication could achieve. 6 months after the incident, Margaret received a letter that made her laugh out loud. It was from Derek, written in the careful handwriting of someone with nothing but time to think about their mistakes. "Colonel Sterling," it read, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I was too blind to see before. You weren't the problem with the Air Force. I was. I spent so much time trying to be what I thought a leader should look like that I never learned what leadership actually meant. I hope the pilots under your command know how lucky they are." Margaret folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't forgive Derek. Forgiveness was something he'd have to earn over years of better choices. But she recognized in his words the first sign that he might finally be learning the lessons his privilege had prevented him from understanding. 1 year after the Phoenix revelation, Edwards Air Force Base hosted its annual air show. The first time in decades that the event was more than just a display of machinery. This year, it was a celebration of the human spirit that powered the world's greatest air force. Margaret stood on the reviewing platform next to General Morrison, watching, as the Thunderbirds performed their precision demonstration above. In the crowd below, she could see hundreds of faces that represented the future of military aviation, diverse, talented, and united by shared purpose, rather than divided by artificial barriers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed, "across the flight line, we're honored to present a special demonstration by Colonel Margaret Ghost Phoenix Sterling flying the F-22 Advanced Tactical Fighter." The crowd erupted in applause as Margaret's modified Raptor appeared on the horizon. This time there was no secrecy, no hidden agenda, just a master pilot sharing her art with people who could appreciate the decades of skill and dedication it represented. Her demonstration was different from the one that had exposed Derek's ignorance. This was joyful, celebratory, showing not just what was possible with advanced technology, but what human excellence could achieve when given the chance to flourish. As she executed a perfect knife-edge pass at near supersonic speed, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 40 years of proving herself, 20 years of hiding her true capabilities, and one perfect day when the truth had finally been revealed. The young pilots in the crowd watched with expressions of awe and inspiration. Among them was Lieutenant Jennifer Park, a 24-year-old Korean-American pilot who'd applied to Edwards specifically because of Margaret's program. For Jennifer and hundreds of others like her, Margaret's story proved that excellence could overcome any obstacle, that respect could be earned regardless of age or gender or background. After the demonstration, Margaret found herself surrounded by young pilots asking questions about flying, about leadership, about how to navigate a career in a profession that didn't always welcome diversity. She answered each question with the patience of someone who remembered asking similar questions decades ago. "Colonel," Lieutenant Park asked, "what advice would you give to someone who feels like they don't fit the traditional image of a military pilot?" Margaret smiled, remembering her own younger self asking the same question. "Never let anyone else define what a warrior looks like. Excellence speaks every language, transcends every boundary, and recognizes no artificial limits. If you can, do the job better than the next person. That's all that matters." As the air show wound down, Margaret walked through the hangar where her humiliation had been transformed into vindication. The space was now home to the Leadership Excellence Center, where officers from around the world came to learn about building inclusive, effective teams. On the wall was a simple plaque that read, "Strength through diversity, excellence through character, victory through unity." Below it was a photo from that day 1 year ago, not of Derek's moment of supposed triumph, but of Margaret standing beside her F-22, surrounded by the diverse group of pilots who represented the Air Force's true future. Rachel Torres, now Lieutenant Colonel Torres and director of the center, joined Margaret by the display. "Any regrets?" Rachel asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. "About exposing Derek? None at all. About the 20 years I spent hiding my true capabilities? That's more complicated. The mission required secrecy, but the cost was watching too many good people suffer under leaders who didn't deserve their authority. And now I wake up every morning knowing that somewhere a young pilot is being judged on their merit, rather than their demographics. Somewhere an experienced aviator is being valued for their wisdom rather than discarded for their age. Somewhere a leader is being chosen for their character rather than their connections." As the sun set over Edwards Air Force Base, Margaret received one final message on her secure phone. It was from the current President of the United States, a brief note that made her laugh and tear up simultaneously. "Colonel Sterling, history will remember your courage in the cockpit, but I'll remember your courage in standing up for what's right. The nation is stronger because of people like you. Thank you for reminding us that our greatest weapons are our values." Margaret looked up at the darkening sky where she'd spent most of her adult life, where she'd tested the boundaries of what was possible and redefined what it meant to be a warrior. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to mentor the next generation, new chances to prove that excellence knew no artificial boundaries. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Derek Harrison had tried to destroy her based on his narrow prejudices and failed spectacularly. More importantly, his failure had exposed a cancer in military culture that could now be treated and cured. The ghost phoenix had risen from the ashes of humiliation to soar higher than ever before, and in her wake she'd cleared the skies for countless others to follow. The old Margaret Sterling, the one who'd hidden her capabilities to maintain operational security, was gone forever. In her place stood someone who could inspire without concealment, lead without compromise, and prove that the greatest strength of any military force wasn't its technology or tactics, but its willingness to recognize and cultivate excellence wherever it was found. As she walked toward her car for the drive home, Margaret heard the sound of jets taking off for night training missions. Young pilots trained in the new way, heading out to master skills that might one day keep the nation safe. The future was in good hands. Derek Harrison had wanted to know what a real warrior looked like. He'd gotten his answer, just not in the way he'd expected. Real warriors didn't just fight enemies, they fought ignorance, prejudice, and the small-minded, thinking that made organizations weaker instead of stronger. The lesson would echo through military culture for generations: respect experience, value diversity, judge character over connections, and never, ever underestimate someone based on their appearance. Margaret Sterling's war wasn't fought with weapons or tactics. It was fought with truth, dignity, and the unshakable belief that excellence would always triumph over prejudice. And she had won. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.